Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Thomas Sharon. I'm a UX researcher here. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Eric Ries, the founder of the Lean Startup Movement. And thank you for coming.
See, I don't know. It's hard to know when you have an audience you don't know. It's hard to know what to say. So some of you maybe know the blog Startup Lessons Learned. Anybody? Quick show of hands. OK, good. Oh, we have true new people. So thank you. Thank you for coming to check it out. So my name's Eric Ries. I don't really want your undivided attention, so keep your laptops on. That's fine. And in fact, if everyone would do me a favor and take your phones out of your pockets. I mean, I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to have this one, but if you could turn them on. No, I'm not joking around. Out of the pockets, please. Because this is going to be a talk. You might get bored, and you might want to tweet amongst yourselves, or I don't know, whatever special internal tools you guys use. Whatever it is, please feel free. All I ask is that you use the Lean Startup hashtag, at least if you're on Twitter. OK, is that fair? Yeah, I won't tell anybody. Don't worry. I'm in New York because I'm writing a book. So one of the things you do when you're writing a book is you have to go to tell as many people as possible that this book is coming out. It'll come out in the fall. I thank you in advance for pre-ordering it. You can do so at lean.st. That's my life now, is as a professional expert selling books, which is a far cry from how I started, which is as a programmer writing code. So I'm one of those people that grew up writing code. I used to write code for a living, which is a job I knew really well and understood. I was pretty good at. And then I started doing startups, and I started to have to manage people who wrote code for a living. I knew that slightly less well. And then I was managing people who manage people who write code for a living. And now I am this professional expert, and so I advise people who manage people who manage people who write code. And so I've become very far removed from the actual work of product development. But that journey has taken me from just writing code to doing this, because I actually think the way that we organize new product development is basically wrong. And that most of the energy that we are investing into what is called entrepreneurship when it's two guys in a garage, or disruptive innovation or something else buzzwordy when it's done inside a big company, is wasting a lot of people's time. And I think we can do something about it. So that's what I wanted to talk to you guys about. Thanks for coming. So anyway, and this book, of course, will be available in stores everywhere in the fall. So if you read the book, you will learn 5 principles of the Lean Startup. And we'll go through them today, and I want to invite you to ask questions either on Twitter if you're not feeling that courageous, or interrupt me at any time, or we'll have time at the end, all right? So entrepreneurs are everywhere. The first thing is, especially in an audience like this, I want to be clear that entrepreneurship is not just about two guys in a garage eating ramen noodles. In fact, what makes you an entrepreneur is not what kind of noodles you eat, but the context in which you operate. And as I've been traveling around talking about Lean Startup, what I have learned is that there are entrepreneurs in all kinds of places you wouldn't necessarily expect. And we have a lot more in common than people realize. Because entrepreneurship is management, but not the kind of general management we're teaching MBAs and that we have studied for the last 100 years, something fundamentally different. It is management of a kind of work that is measured by validated learning rather than just making stuff. We accelerate that learning through something called the build, measure, learn feedback loop. And then we measure and hold entrepreneurs accountable using a new accounting system called innovation accounting. Now, I apologize. You came to I'm sure you saw the signs up. You're like, ooh, an exciting talk about entrepreneurship and startups. That's going to be cool. And what did you get? You got management and accounting, which are perhaps the 2 most boring topics on earth. So if anybody wants to leave now, I won't be offended. It's OK. Because the truth is, what do people know about entrepreneurship? I feel like, who saw The Social Network? OK, right. So I feel like that's probably the best modern example of the entrepreneurship story we're all used to. And you see this in magazines, and you see it in The Social Network. I noticed last night that the story Ghostbusters, remember Ghostbusters, the movie, is an entrepreneurship story. They start a business. Everything's the same. It's like the same plot structure as The Social Network, believe it or not, except it has a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, which is awesome. In these entrepreneurship stories, what happens? It's a story in 3 parts. Act 1, the plucky protagonist, his character flaws, and how he came up with his amazing idea. Act 2, what I call the photo montage. It's usually about 2 minutes long. It goes from kind of they finally get the thing to work, then like they're writing on whiteboards and drinking some beer, pounding on some keyboards, and then they get their first customer, and then that's pretty much it. No dialogue or anything in the photo montage. And then Act 3, now that we're on the cover of magazines, how do we divide up the spoils, and who's in charge, and who sues who, and what do we deal with the EPA and all that stuff for fans of Ghostbusters? What I think is really interesting about these stories about entrepreneurship is that 95% of the time of the movie is spent in Acts 1 and Act 3, even though in real life, all of the important work of entrepreneurship happens during the photo montage. But the problem is, from a storytelling point of view, the photo montage, the reason it has no dialogue and it only lasts 2 minutes is it's unspeakably boring. What do we do as entrepreneurs that actually makes a difference? We spend our time trying to figure out which customers to listen to and who to ignore, how to prioritize product features. I mean, you guys, how many product prioritization meetings do you go to? It's not exactly the stuff of movies. It's unbelievably boring. And how do we hold people accountable? How do we measure to figure out if we're actually making progress or building something that nobody wants? See, watching somebody pretend like they don't have anxiety, that their vision is wrong, is not very good for movies. But that's what most entrepreneurs do. And so we're going to have to talk about stuff like management and accounting, because it's time to go inside the photo montage and try to figure out what can we do to make the actual work of entrepreneurship more effective. So entrepreneurs are everywhere. My goal, my mission in doing this whole lean startup thing has been to try to put the practice of entrepreneurship on a more rigorous footing. And so I started out with a definition. Here's mine. What is a startup? A human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So I think the most important part of this definition, and for our purposes today, a very important part of our discussion, is what it excludes. It doesn't say anything about what size of your company is. It could be 5 people, 5,000, or 50,000. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what sector of the economy you work in. It really doesn't even matter what industry you're in. If you fundamentally are operating with extreme uncertainty about who is your customer, what product do they actually want, and how do we build a sustainable business, then you are an entrepreneur. And when I work with large companies, one of the things I've been trying to do is to get them to adopt entrepreneurship as a job title. Entrepreneurship is a career. When you become an entrepreneur, you are no longer an engineer. You are no longer a marketer. You are no longer a UX designer. Whatever it is you used to do, all of a sudden now you have a different job title and you have entered a new career path. But unfortunately, we don't get the memo that tells you that, so it can be a little bit confusing. That's all a fancy way of saying a startup is an experiment. What I mean by experiment is not just like, let's ship it and see what happens. Okay, that's not science. If you just put some compounds in a beaker and heat it up, you might look like you're doing science. But unless you have a hypothesis that you're trying to test, you have theory that it suggests which experiments are going to help you, and then you make specific predictions, then fundamentally you're not conducting an experiment. And we mean in the lean startup model, experiment in the scientific sense. We're trying to create a science of entrepreneurship that will help us to stop waste people's time, because that's what we're doing on an industrial scale. And you guys know, anyone who's worked on new products knows that most of them are doomed to failure. And when you get at the end of that product, I mean, as an engineer, I kept having over and over again the experience of working on amazing technology that is today sitting on a shelf or worse, that fundamentally nobody is using. And I kept looking for more and more technical solutions to that problem. I thought, if we could just get the right development methodology, if we just had the right amount of unit tests or the right this or the right that, then we could stop that happening. But the biggest waste that product development faces today is not building things inefficiently, but building things very efficiently that nobody wants. And I brought a demonstration. We all know that most startups fail. Who remembers Web 2.0? Remember Web 2.0 and that was really cool? At the height of Web 2.0 in 2006, a graphic designer put together this graphic. Have you ever seen this before? This is the logos of all the incredible Web 2.0 companies that were going to change the world. And in just 3 years, in 2009, a different graphic designer was feeling a slightly different set of emotions when they put together this graphic. Our 3-year report card in Web 2.0, I mean, the blood red X's, okay, these are all companies that are just dead. I think for our purposes today, though, a much more important part of the chart to look at are the green circles. I won't point at any of them in particular, but some of those green circles are supposed to be the success stories of Web 2.0. But for this chart, what that means is they're companies that were acquired by a larger company, including this one. And listen, I'm all for people making money. So when a company gets acquired by another company, usually investors and the founders make some money, and that's all good. But my question is, which of these companies are actually success stories? Success stories by the higher definition, not of did anybody make money, but rather, which of these companies succeeded in living up to the aspirations, dreams, time, talent, and energy of the founders and their investors, and more importantly, their employees? See, look, we all know that when big companies buy startups, at least half the time, they die afterwards. So we buy something for hundreds of millions of dollars, and then we wind up selling it 3 years later for tens of millions of dollars. That's not supposed to happen. In general management, that doesn't happen. When you buy an asset, it depreciates in a predictable way. But when big companies buy startups, it doesn't happen exactly like it's supposed to. And I think the problems that corp dev departments have when deciding how to buy startups and which startups to buy and then how to integrate them into the parent company are the exact same problems that internal innovators who are trying to create brand new startups inside big companies have. And they're the exact same problems that venture-backed entrepreneurs have with their investors. All of us lack a theory of entrepreneurship to guide our behavior. And so we're falling back on tools and methods that are not appropriate to entrepreneurship. That's my belief. So I don't think it has to be this way. See, it's one thing if startups were failing because they were taking too much risk. You know, if one of these companies was working on teleportation, and then it turned out to be too hard, we couldn't quite get the technology for quantum entanglement to work like we thought, like, I accept that kind of failure, that happens. But I chose Web 2.0 for my demonstration, especially for you guys. You know, there's not a single company on this chart where you would say, boy, I wonder if that can be built, right? Geez, I wonder if that new social network, is it possible to build it? We all know, software companies, we can build anything we can imagine. Think about that for a second. The dominant question of our time is not can it be built, but should it be built? And the issue is, can we build a sustainable business around a particular product? So the future of our society, our economic growth in the future, the GDP growth of industrialized countries in the future is going to be dependent on the quality and character of our collective imaginations, which I think is a very strange place to be. That is really different than the kinds of economic problems that general management was designed to solve in the 20th century. Now, most of my startups have failed. So I know that's not how you're supposed to start one of these talks. It's like, hi, I'm a professional expert, and I have had more failures than successes, so you can be just like me if you'd follow my advice. So, you know, I'm sorry about that. But, you know, those of you who spend any time around entrepreneurship know the truth that where there's startups, there's a lot of failure. And it has to be somebody's fault in a talk like this. And obviously, it shouldn't be my fault, because I'm the expert. And preferably, it should be the fault of someone who's dead, so that they can't argue. So I chose this guy. This is Frederick Winslow Taylor. He died in 1915, which is very handy for the purpose of this talk, because it means he can't talk back. So sorry, Fred. Fred Taylor invented something called scientific management in the early 20th century, which today we call management. See, people don't really remember Fred Taylor, and those who've studied scientific management at school probably remember him for some of his outdated and really ridiculous ideas, like time and motion studies, or the idea that a worker is basically just an automaton who should be told what to do. The reason we don't give Fred Taylor the credit he deserves is because he invented things that to us are so obvious, we can't imagine them ever having been invented. It doesn't make sense. Like, everybody knows that work should be done as efficiently as possible, right? And that we should treat work like a system, and that we should have managers organize that system. That's just plain common sense. And my favorite, Fred Taylor invented something called the task and bonus system, which we just call tasks. The idea was if you want to do a large project, the best thing to do is to decompose that project into a series of individual tasks, assign those tasks to functional specialists, and everyone just does their part, knowing that if everybody does their part well and everybody else does their part, the whole will actually work out like the manager said. And here's the best part. If you do your task particularly well, better than expected, you should be paid a bonus rather than being penalized. What could be more obvious, except in the 19th century, the way work was organized is that if you did your task better than expected, you were penalized. Why? Because that showed a lack of integrity. You obviously could have done it better before, but you didn't. So that proves that you're a liar. But it gets worse. Not only are you a liar, what about all your compatriots, your coworkers who do the same task the old slow way? They're liars too. All of you have been lying this whole time, and you should all be penalized. Imagine working in a factory where if you can come up with a better way to do your repetitive job, not only would you be penalized, so would all your coworkers. Right? Can you imagine the culture that would grow up around such a thing? That everybody is working really hard to make sure that nobody ever does anything in any way better, because then we'll all be in trouble. That phenomenon was so widespread in the 19th century, they had a name for it. They called it soldiering. That everybody knew workers were intentionally soldiering on, trying to do work as slow as possible so that nobody would get in trouble. Now, we laugh when we think about that kind of thing happening in a factory, because to us, the way that we manage physical products and just all regular general management is light years beyond what was possible in Fred Taylor's day. But they also believe something else that I think maybe you'll find a little bit familiar. They had this idea that we basically was the great man theory of work. That fundamentally the job of managers was to select the best possible person. Of course, this is the early 20th century, so a great man of upstanding character with good integrity, the right attributes, put them in the job and fundamentally leave them alone. Because if you just trust a great man to figure out what needs to get done, they would figure it out. Does that sound familiar? We still manage knowledge work and innovation work that same way. We still believe in the great man theory of entrepreneurship, and we believe it especially about the great man software developers. And yet, when we look back on this time, decades from now, I think we're going to laugh at the kinds of things that we do when we need to develop new products. It will seem as antique to our future selves as Fred Taylor feels to us. Because I think that entrepreneurship is management. It's just a different kind of management than the general management that has been practiced since Fred Taylor's day. So we need to create a different paradigm for management that's not better than general management, it's not worse than, it's simply a parallel discipline specifically for entrepreneurship. And so here's my attempt. The first concept in the kind of entrepreneurial management toolbox is this thing we call the pivot. Who's tired of hearing about pivots already? Anybody? Okay, I apologize. In Silicon Valley, everybody's hand is up, by the way. This word has become ridiculously overused. Believe it or not, I saw this just the other day in the New Yorker magazine. Can you read this caption? I'm not leaving you, I'm pivoting to another man. So this word started in Lean Startup, and then it kind of became this monster of an overused, overhyped concept. Typical for Silicon Valley, we went from not knowing what the concept was to being tired of hearing it and claiming that it's overhyped without having passed through the intervening stage of ever learning how to use it correctly. That's how we operate with the hype cycle in Silicon Valley. So I'm sorry about that. I didn't intend. But you can't understand anything about entrepreneurship unless you have a word for this concept, because it is the universal constant of all successful startups. If you can get the real story of what actually happened in the early stages of a company, you will find out that successful startup founders do not have better ideas than the failed ones. Contrary to what you see in the movies, most startup founders of successful companies had ludicrously bad ideas at the beginning. And what's amazing about the successful startup founders is not that they just persevered indefinitely, but that they have this funny combination that when they run into difficulty, it's not just that they gave up ship and went home, neither did they persevere the plane straight into the ground. They do this thing we call the pivot. By analogy to basketball, one foot firmly rooted in what we've learned, changing one other thing about the business at a time. And the premise of the lean startup is as follows. If we can reduce the time between pivots, we can increase our odds of success before we run out of money. See, the way you think about startup runway is not how many months of burn do I have left. It's fundamentally how many opportunities to pivot do I have left. And sure, we can extend the runway by raising more money, but we can also extend the runway by figuring out how to pivot sooner. And every day we shave off that time is a magical extension of our runway by a proportional amount. Does that make sense? Okay, getting at least a few nods, that's good. So to increase the odds of success, we need to figure out how can we pivot sooner. We need to bring our focus to validated learning. Anyone know this? This is the waterfall methodology of software development. It's traditional in one of these talks when you're going to beat up on methodologies to call one the waterfall methodology. So this is mine. This is just Fred Taylor's ideas applied to software development. When I was trained as an engineer in Silicon Valley, I was taught this as the manufacturing metaphor of software development. You can imagine, incidentally, how pissed off I was when I found out that they don't use this in manufacturing anymore. This is way obsolete. So it's not clear to me what our excuse is in software development for copying an obsolete model of manufacturing. But I understand why it's so appealing. The idea is that since software is so intangible, we like to imagine our work traveling on an assembly line, virtual assembly line, from department to department. And if everybody does their part and trusts everybody else to do their part, everything works out fine. It's entertaining to beat up on the waterfall methodology because it has such a bad track record. But it's important to understand that waterfall works as long as the solution and the problem are both relatively well understood. So if we're building something that is fundamentally similar to things we have built in the past, this works great. If you're building a video game sequel, amen. If you're building the next iteration of a product that zillions of people already use, that's fine. But entrepreneurship doesn't deal with those circumstances, so it's basically a waste of time. Now, when you do waterfall, you have this problem I call achieving failure, where you successfully build the wrong thing, and you boast about how good you are at doing it. My question is, you go to a startup board meeting or a milestone review meeting for most new products, what do we talk about? Milestones, right? We are on track. We're building the features we said we were going to build. We talk about our gross numbers, like, hey, we have this many customers, just like we said. I remember being in a company once that was had a plan that said we're going to have this nice hockey stick-shaped growth, and we were on the nice long flat part, and everything's going according to plan. Sounds a little familiar, maybe. And you're going to court, everything, like, the plan is genius. Like, nobody's using our product as expected, as expected. But next week, it should turn up. And of course, how do you know if you were on the long flat part and you're going to just, and you're on the hockey stick, or you're just going to coast indefinitely? I believe we can actually answer those questions quantitatively. We'll get to that. So to me, we are bragging about how we're building a product that nobody wants, but we're doing it on time and on budget. As if I have this image of a general manager, like, driving a car off a cliff. And like, while they're driving, they're like, but I'm getting great gas mileage, right off the cliff. That's what startup failures mostly look like. And I think that's true in big companies too. Not that I would presume to talk about you, but in other companies I've seen for sure. So in manufacturing, they abandoned that linear way of working. That's why we call it lean startup, by analogy to the lean manufacturing. These are two other, unfortunately, deceased men who made this possible. Deming is famous for having said the customer is the most important part of the production line, by which he meant everything that we do should be gauged, should be decided by whether the customer cares that we do it. So if the thing is of high quality in the customer's eyes, that matters. But if we're doing a lot of internal transport and the meetings that we have, the specification, the customer doesn't care about any of that internal stuff, so let's try to eliminate it. When these ideas were handed down to me as a Silicon Valley engineer, they look like this. Here's our very own guru of extreme programming, Kent Beck. You guys know Agile very well, so I won't bother getting into it. Suffice to say that all Agile methodologies have their origins inside the IT departments of big companies, every single one. And there's a reason for that. They are designed for situations where it is the problem that's known, but the solution is unknown. And so by building something that is well understood iteratively, we can increase the odds that the project will be successful. So the classic Chrysler Corporation needs a new payroll system. Agile to the rescue. But this isn't the world that we live in as startups either. If the customer is the most important part of the assembly line, what do we do if we don't know who the customer is? Then in whose eyes should we judge our work? In extreme programming, which customer should we sit down next to the engineers to tell them what to do? The assumption of Agile and all previous management approaches is that there is somebody who can give us an authoritative, definitive answer to design questions. And in entrepreneurship, that assumption breaks down. We are working on products where nobody knows what the customer wants. At best, we have a theory, a hypothesis, a plan, a hope. And so this is what lean startup looks like. Now, in lean startup, we have our own guru, Steve Blank. He's still alive, but I put him in sepia tones, just to kind of be consistent. Steve invented something called customer development, which is a iterative process of trying to figure out who your customer is, which we can merge in parallel with Agile development to this kind of company-wide feedback loop of learning and discovery. This changes the unit of progress from making stuff to validated learning. Let me try to illustrate what I mean. I created a company called IMVU in 2004. We make a 3D avatar instant messaging technology. And at that time, we wanted to be the next AOL, back when that was still cool. And we wanted to kind of take over the hot new social technology of IM. We really thought that was the wave of the future. Whoops. And here was our plan. See, everybody knows that instant messaging is a network effects business, right? So therefore, if you want to get someone to switch from their IM network to yours, it's kind of a pain because they'd have to bring all their friends with them. So there's high switching costs. And therefore, IM is an industry characterized by high barriers to entry. That's kind of the MBA analysis of the instant messaging market. And we spent a lot of time figuring that out at the whiteboard. And we said, we need a strategy for avoiding that problem. Here it is. We'll create an instant messaging add-on that interoperates with all of the existing networks and can bring 3D avatar technology to your IM client. So we take your boring 2D IM and make it 3D. Wow. This is before Avatar and the current 3D craze. So we thought we're really onto a real trend. And so here's the reason we were so excited about that strategy. It would be inherently viral. Because when you would decide you want to go 3D, you'd have to be IMing with somebody, and they would automatically get a text link inserted into the chat stream that they could just one click, pick up, boom, IMView installs. Now you're both in 3D. Doesn't that seem like a good idea? When we meet with investors, we met with investors at that time, the strategy part of it, they're like, that does sound very promising. And when I tell the story to MBAs now, I get a lot of nods. It's that is good strategy. I don't know what the hell this guy's been talking about till now, but this I understand. This is strategy. And the strategy actually is very good except for the tiniest problem, which is that every single thing I just said is false. Customers actually don't have high switching costs for IM. Their network effects are way overblown. And our customers refused to invite their friends. It was a total deal breaker. We'd have customers come in for an in-person usability test. We're paying them to be there. And we'd be like, OK, download our instant messaging add-on. And the customer would be like, what is that? Like, instant messaging add-on. It interoperates with all your IM. And then you might get a picture of a 16-year-old being like, what? Is it an IM client? And we're like, no, you don't want to have to run a whole nother IM client. They're like, why not? Like, oh, it'd be so complicated to download. They're like, dude, I have like 7 IM clients. What's the big deal? And we're like, there are 7 IM clients? So that was problem number 1. We're like, listen, we are paying you to be here, so how about you download this thing, OK? All right, fine. Download the thing. OK, customize your avatar. They love this part. Like, ooh, it's really cool, interactive, like that. Great. OK, now you customize your avatar. Invite one of your friends. No way. Why not? I don't know if this thing is cool yet, and I'm not going to invite my friends to something that turns out to be lame. See, I know people who are selling like business software are used to the concept of mission critical. We didn't understand that in our business, mission critical, like the law commandments of mission critical software, one of them needs to be like, do not make teenager look lame in front of their friends. Total deal breaker. They wouldn't do it. I mean, we were like, but we're paying you to be in this usability test. And it's just like, I'm not doing it. You can keep your money. I will not. It's not worth it to me. And they kept saying things like, let me try it first. Try it out first. And then if it's cool, then I'll invite one of my friends. And we were like, oh, OK. We're from the video game industry, so we knew what that meant. That meant single player mode. So we built another version of the product, single player mode. Allowed you to, we can have another teenager come in, right, for usability test. Hey, download this instant messaging add-on. What the hell is that? Just do it. OK, customize your avatar. Oh, that's cool. OK, try it by yourself. And they could check out the avatar, dress it up, do the moves, the whole thing, learn how to use the chat bubbles. And then we're like, OK, now invite one of your friends, teenager. No way. Why not? This thing is lame. And we're like, but we told you it was going to be so lame. I mean, we're supposed to be listening to customers, but they don't know what the hell they want. They told us to build this thing, and we're like, but it'll be so cool once you invite one of your friends. And it's just like, listen, old man, I'm not doing it. And we were really devastated. OK, so anyway, long story short, this was a total deal breaker. This strategy is completely flawed in every respect because it's based on empirically incorrect facts. Now, we wound up having to pivot the company, and we created our own instant messaging network, and it all turned out fine. But I'd like you, if you would, just for a minute, to sympathize with me personally, okay? Because I was the engineer. I was the CTO of this company. It was my job to write the software to do instant messaging interoperability. So I wrote, I don't know, 25,000 lines of code or something. I did it all agile, refactored, really elegantly structured, if I do say so myself, good unit test coverage, the whole shebang. And all of my code got thrown out. The good code got thrown out, and the bad code got thrown out. The well-factored code got thrown out. The stuff I was proud to show my mom, and the stuff I wouldn't want anyone to see, it all was equally thrown out. Because Eric's rule of quality is, if you don't know who the customer is, then you don't know what quality means. So failure is a great equalizer of quality. It all had to be thrown out. And I was really depressed. Because you got to understand, we had spent 6 months killing ourselves to build this product. And we had spent, I don't know, how many hours of my life that I could never get back arguing with each other about the following. Which bugs did we absolutely positively have to fix, and which ones could we live without? Sound familiar? Which features just had to be in version 1, or which ones could we just maybe postpone to a different release? That's what we spent all of our time doing. And yet we had this problem, which is that customers would not download our product. Like, this product sucked. It was really buggy. It would crash your computer. Like, I was really embarrassed to have shipped it. And we almost didn't ship it. We were so embarrassed. But then I was actually relieved, because nobody found out how bad it was, because nobody would use it. But then I was like, wait, something is not right here. Why am I relieved that nobody's using the product? That doesn't seem right. And long story short, my co-founders dragged me kicking and screaming to the realization it was time to pivot. We had to throw that code away. And we created a standalone IM network, and we were much more successful, la-di-da. But here's the thing. I had to make myself feel better somehow, because I was like, gosh, would the company have been just as well off if I had spent the last 6 months on a beach somewhere, having nice drinks, and doing nothing, as I was? Like, what did I even need to be here, given that all the work that I did was thrown away? Anyone feel like that's true? Anyone know what the excuse I used was to make myself feel better? You can shout it out. It's OK. I guess, yeah.
You built the team.
What's that?
You built the team.
We had the team at the beginning. What did they need me for? Why was it worth having done this exercise in the first place? What's that? Because I learned something. Thank you. The last excuse in the book, if you've utterly failed to execute, so you could always claim to have been a good learning experience. At least you learned something. I mean, I don't tell you guys, in general management, you claim to have learned something, you're likely to be fired. Right? Because a general manager who learns something, one of two things is true. Either they didn't make a very good plan, in which case definitely should be fired, or even worse, they made a really good plan and failed to execute it. Like, definitely fire that guy. So I think it's natural that we have a little bit of an aversion to want to just say that we learned anything, because that is very dangerous. But in entrepreneurship, failure is, not only is failure an option, it's practically the only option. It's what happens when reality intervenes with our plans.
So what did you learn?
So here's what we learned specifically. We learned the hard way that customers did not want to use our product to connect with their existing friends. They wanted to use it to make new friends. That doesn't seem like a very big deal. I mean, it's only a very modest change in semantics, but from a code and product point of view, that is a radically different product. It required a very different experience. And we didn't throw out every line of code, but we had to throw out a lot. The pivot was quite dramatic. And I made myself feel better with this whole learning story until I asked myself the following question. I mean, literally, I was up nights once I had this question asked to me, which was, wait a minute. If my goal of the last 6 months was to learn this important thing about customers, why did it take 6 months? How come the word learning is only coming up now after we failed and we need an excuse? We never used the word learning, not one time during those 6 months. All we ever did was argue about features and bugs. And then I was like, but would we have had the same learning if we'd built a slightly different first product? Like, for example, did we have to support all 7 IM networks? What if we'd supported only 3? Would the learning value have been the same? Sure, customers won't download, so who cares? But what if we'd supported only 1 network? Learning value the same. Now, that's a lot of code. Between 7 networks and 1, that's a lot less code needed to be written. But this is the thought that literally made me sick to my stomach. I said, wait a minute. What if we had just created a single web page, and in 3 hours created a photo mock-up of what the product was going to look like, and said, hey, download this amazing 3D avatar instant messaging add-on, and had a big download button? Would we even have had to create the second page where we admit that we didn't build the product, or would a 404 have been adequate? Come on, it's the 404, obviously, because nobody would download the product. It was a deal breaker. Nobody wanted it. That meant that we didn't even need page 2. And that was really upsetting to me personally. Why? Because I look at my business card, and what did it say? It said a lot of things, but all I saw was guy who writes code. My job is to make features. So if I went home at the end of the day and I read good code, I had a good day. And now, but then I was like, but if my goal is to learn this thing about customers and I can do it without code, is that my job? Is it possible that something I could do in 3 hours is just as meritorious as something that requires 25,000 lines of code? It didn't seem right. But I think that's actually true. Fundamentally, startups exist to learn how to build a sustainable business. We call it validated learning because we have to back up that learning quantitatively. Any old idiot can tell a good story. But we need a system for rigorously assessing, are we actually learning how to build a sustainable business? And everything else is a complete and total waste of time, including our precious code. Now, in the lean manufacturing revolution, the first question they had to teach people to ask was, what is the difference between value and waste? And in a factory, this is actually relatively straightforward. Value is the stuff that we make that customers want, and waste is everything else. But if our unit of progress is going to be learning, then our unit of value has become intangible, and now we have an issue, which is, OK, we can eliminate all the stuff that we do that doesn't contribute to learning. So we have this concept in Lean Startup called minimum viable product, which is what really needs to be in that first version. Now we have a good answer. Only what is necessary to learn whether our plan is correct or not. Everything else is extraneous. But that's still a little bit vague. And so the next step in lean manufacturing was to focus on cycle time. And so what that looks like is this. Very simple heuristic. This is the flux capacitor of Lean Startup. All we are as a software startup is a catalyst that turns ideas into code. When customers interact with that code, they create data which we can choose to measure quantitatively and qualitatively. And then if we want, we can learn impacting our next set of ideas. This we can use to put the concept of the pivot on a more rigorous foundation. A pivot is one major turn through this feedback loop. And the heuristic for any kind of startup advice that anyone wants to give you is really simple. Does it minimize total time through this loop? So I don't know about you. I go to a lot of startup talks. I read a lot of startup blogs. All the advice is like this. It's really important to have great design. Design always wins. Except Craigslist didn't have very good design, and neither did eBay, so sometimes it's fine to have no design. But make sure it's very scalable, because you don't want to be the next Friendster, except that Facebook wasn't very scalable, and it was fine. So make sure you have good design, and design doesn't matter. It's scalable, but not too scalable. It's not very helpful advice. And if you go down the list, it's like make sure you raise plenty of money, but not too much money. Make sure you have the right kind of people, but not those other kind of people. But actually, sometimes those other kind of people are fine, right? And we focus on all this contradictory stuff, because for any particular piece of advice, I can find you somebody who followed that advice and then made a lot of money. I can also find you somebody who didn't follow that advice and made a lot of money. I can find you people who followed that advice and made no money, and people who didn't follow that advice. I can find all 4 quadrants of the logical possibilities chart. So how do we know what advice to take and what not? I think this is the heuristic we want to use. If it gets us through this feedback loop on a sustainable basis faster, it's a good idea, and if not, not. There's a lot more, of course, to Lean Startup. There's a zillion things on this graph. You can read them on my blog, Startup Lessons Learned. Of course, you can buy a certain book. I've heard it's coming out in the fall. It's really good. All of these techniques, like continuous deployment, where we put software into production like 50 times a day on average, so 20 minutes from the main trunk to production, no branches. Things like Net Promoter Score, where we can evaluate in real time using a tracking survey what customers really think about our product. Everything you know about usability tests, 5 Whys, which is drawn from the Toyota production system. Each of these techniques has they operate at one stage of the feedback loop, but they have the net effect of minimizing total time. That's what the Lean Startup is about. But I want to mention one more really boring topic called innovation accounting. See, we've forgotten what accounting was designed for. I mean, we think of accounting as that thing that the really boring people do to keep track of where the money goes, right? That's pretty much what it is. It's just a ledger that says, where did all the money go? But accounting was invented for a very different reason. It was invented to drive accountability across departments. Because if you want to have a large company with many different divisions, you have to be able to hold the managers of those divisions accountable to something so that you know that they did a good job. General Motors, which invented most of our modern management paraphernalia, had this concept. When I first read this concept, I literally laughed out loud. I couldn't believe. It was called the standard volume. It was the ideal number of cars that General Motors should sell, division by division, in an ideal year. And they actually had the math and the staff, macroeconomic staff, to figure out, given all the macroeconomic data available, how to translate the standard year into our coming actual year. So they could go division by division and tell each manager, given that we're in a recession or the economy is booming, you should sell this number of Oldsmobiles. And therefore, if you sell more than the standard number, you get a bonus. And if not, you failed. And it's not fair, if you didn't have that concept, then if it's a good year, all the managers seem like they're doing well. And in a recession, everyone seems like they're doing bad. You can't tell which manager actually made a difference. Now, when I read that concept, I laughed out loud because I was like, wait a minute. Are you telling me there was a time when people could make forecasts about what was going to happen in the future, and then it actually happened? I don't know about you. I have never in my whole life seen a forecast of anything that turned out to be remotely accurate. No startup I have ever worked for has had a roadmap that turned out to be remotely true. I've never seen a company say how many customers they would have in the future and then deliver. Never seen it. So to me, the idea of the standard volume is ridiculous. But I understand when you have a sufficiently large company and you have a sufficiently long operating history, you can do this. Maybe this sounds a little bit familiar. So if we're using accounting to drive accountability, but all of our accounting depends on having a long operating history and a lot of customers, how do we drive accountability if there's no customers yet? Right? If the CFO of a company, hypothetically speaking, gives a certain team a bunch of money and sends them off to some remote location to do their work, like to Australia or something, and then they hang out in Australia or whatever, and then a year later, they say, what are your results? And the team says, they're not very good, but we're on the brink of success. How is the manager who gave them all that money supposed to know if A, they are in fact on the brink of the success, they're just on the flat part of the hockey stick, or if they've just been goofing off for a year? Or more likely, if they're just executing a bad plan. And what kind of milestones should we hold them accountable to if we can't hold them accountable to the gross numbers of customers? Because that's fundamentally not fair. If we're focusing on the gross numbers, incidentally, we might decide we're going to do a lot of publicity and PR. To be like, this thing is going to be amazing to drive customer awareness. But we all know, if you happen to find yourself in such a team, that early awareness is fundamentally lethal. But it's not fair to just say, well, just let them do whatever and hope for the best. You guys know exactly how that turns out. So what is the solution? I think we can answer that question now with something I call innovation accounting. Here it is. Instead of focusing on product milestones and gross numbers, we have 3 learning milestones we can focus on. We have to take our attention away from the vanity metrics. Okay, vanity metrics are the numbers you put in a press release to make your competitors feel bad. Like the total number of pages on the internet that you've indexed. I happen to like that one a lot. Right? There was a time when we had a big number of in-pages index battle. It's like we have 4 billion and you only have 2 billion. But like, what does that actually tell you about the quality of somebody's business? Absolutely nothing. Right? It could be 4 billion really dumb pages. That could be one guy's website who's just really excited about the number 4 billion. Or it could be 4 billion people who each have one crappy website. You read TechCrunch, you're going to see a zillion stories about this company has sent 400 messages through their platform. But is that 400 million people who are all about to churn out, or one very excited customer? We don't know. We used to have a competitor at InView that would report on the gross GDP of the value of their whole user-to-user economy. And my CEO used to sometimes come to me and be like, these guys have a $400 million GDP. What's our GDP? I was like, what does that even mean in our context? Like, what, if two users like exchanged like some virtual currency, is that part of the, like, I don't know. It's a completely meaningless number, but it sure made us feel bad. I'm all for vanity metrics and press releases. Go to town. That's fine for making your competitors feel bad. But what happens when we use those numbers to guide our own business is that when the numbers go up, it's always because of what I was working on. Right? Everyone thinks, I made this feature last week, and now the numbers went up, so obviously it's due to me. Of course, the people in marketing feel like it's because of their new marketing campaign, et cetera. What happens when the numbers go down? Anyone ever been in that meeting? Oh, it's seasonal effects. I never ever hear seasonal effects used to describe numbers going up. Never in my career. It's always like if it's going up, it's features. If it's down, it's seasonal effects, or worse, those idiots in marketing. And over time, you know, each of us lives in our own little private reality where the stuff I do makes numbers go up and the stuff that those guys do make numbers go down. So okay, is it any wonder that we think each other are idiots? Now expand that organization larger and larger and larger as people are in ever more permanent silos, speaking their own language, living in their own private reality. Is there any wonder that they have trouble working together? Maybe that sounds a little bit familiar. Okay, just checking. So instead of that, we're going to use actionable metrics, which are about per customer behaviors, things that can be measured at microscale. And the first thing we're going to do is establish the baseline. So now we can put the purpose of the minimum viable product on a much more rigorous setting. Somewhere in our business plan, there is a model that says, hey, if customers behave in this way, they will have zillions of them over time. And we can't get into all the details of how to build those models. Of course, there's a great book coming out. You can learn all about it. In the meantime, what we want to do is just figure out what are the real numbers for each of those inputs at microscale. That's what the minimum viable product is for. So if there's some number, some spreadsheet somewhere that says, hey, 10% of customers who come to our website should register for our product, then we should have like a big banner in our office somewhere that's like, we must have 10% conversion or we die. And then we need to have a minimum viable product as soon as possible to find out what that number is today. And most likely, when you do that experiment, the baseline will be horrible. Like, it'll only be 1%, and it's supposed to be 10%. And like, oh my God. In general management, that provokes a crisis, because now we've failed, and uh-oh. There's this thing called the audacity of zero, which is like how much easier it is to raise money and get people excited when you have no results. Right? Having $0 of revenue in a startup is a great time to raise money. Having $1 of revenue is a disaster. Because with zero, it's like, well, why is it zero? Because we haven't launched. So obviously, it should be zero. Everyone's like, oh, that makes sense. God forbid you have $1 of revenue. Because then it's like, why is it only $1? I thought this thing was going to be an overnight success, and now you're proving to me that it isn't. Right? So with zero, you can always be an overnight success. With any other number, you're screwed. But we need to change that. We need to say, finding out the truth of where we are right now is progress. It's a milestone that we should celebrate. And then we do step two, which is we tune the engine. We make product development changes that are not designed to drive huge gross numbers, but to make those conversion numbers go from the horrible baseline to the ideal in our business plan. And whenever I've done this with teams, I've only ever seen two cases. Case one, it's supposed to be 1%. You know, it's 1%, but it's got to be 10%. So a few iterations in, it's 1%, 3%, 6%, 6.5%, 7.5%. Now, it's not 10% yet, so the model isn't exactly working, but you can kind of say, are we going to get there? Yeah, probably. You know, each thing that we do seems to drive the number up a little bit. We seem to be kind of heading in the right direction. We're split testing to make sure that the changes we're making are in fact driving the change. It's all good. Here's situation number two. It's 1%, 3%, 3.5%, 3.75%, 3.8%, 3.81%. Now, the numbers are going up every time. So it's not like the numbers are going down. It's not like it's zero, but you might ask yourself a question. 4, 5, 6 months into hitting that asymptote, are we ever going to be 10%? I think it's safe to conclude the answer is no. Of course, theoretically, it is possible. The next iteration will be that magic one more feature that gets you to 10%. But in reality, that's not the case. When the team gets to the point where hitting that diminishing returns, everybody knows you're not going to make it, and you enter the land of death march. So instead, I recommend we do 3. We schedule the meeting in advance that 3 months from now, 6 months, whenever it is, we're going to have a meeting to decide whether to pivot or persevere. And by that meeting, we will have the data about whether our efforts to tune the engine are working or hitting diminishing returns. And so we have all these concepts in entrepreneurship, like product market fit, that are very vague. This system allows us to put those concepts on a much more quantitative basis. We can't turn whether to pivot into a formula. I can't tell you what to do. It still relies on human judgment, just like science does. But if we make specific predictions, if we use innovation accounting as our accountability model, then we can be training our judgment to get better over time, just like in science. So don't do product development astrology, do product development science. I left a bunch of questions unanswered because we only have a short time together, like, well, how do you know specifically when to pivot? What's the relationship between our vision, our strategy, and our product? What exactly should we measure in each of the engines of growth? How is it that products grow? How do we know if we're on that hockey stick or on the long, flat part forever? How do we test if we're creating value? What specific features should be in the MVP? Can we go faster? The answers to these questions and so many more are in the new book coming out in the fall called The Lean Startup. You can, of course, pre-order it at lean.st. I thank you very, very much for doing so. I'll just give you my contact information. Please be in touch if I can be helpful in any way. We have a brand new website, which is itself a minimum viable product, about theleanstartup.com. Please check it out. We would love your feedback. And you are all officially invited to the Startup Lessons Learned Conference, which is going to be May 23rd in San Francisco. But we also simulcast. Last year we were in 50 cities, so presumably we'll be in New York too. I hope if you can make it, you will drop me a line. And if this proves in any way helpful, I hope you'll email me and tell me about it. Thank you all very much. Do we have time for a few questions? OK, let her rip. If I stumped all of Google, I'm going to be pretty proud of myself. It's going right on Twitter. Sweet.
So I just wanted to touch on something that you mentioned was kind of reviewed too many times, the pivot. I have trouble understanding exactly how much work to put in for the first pivot. I think the second and the third might be a little bit more, okay, maybe not, but just starting off, like how much work should you really put in for that first pivot?
There's no way to answer that question in general, honestly. You have to put yourself in a position where the team will know if it's working or not working. And the problem is that most teams have a plan, which is basically to ship it and see what happens. And the problem with ship it and see what happens, you can feel like you're being very agile, but you're guaranteed to succeed at seeing what happens. And so you'll therefore always feel like it was worth doing, and you'll feel like you're on the right track no matter what. The only way to get yourself into a position where you have to pivot is to make specific, concrete predictions ahead of time that, if they turn out to be wrong, will actually call your theory into doubt. And the issue is that we all know that most projections for new products are complete BS. You have to tell the CFO or whoever that you're going to have a zillion trillion customers in year 5. Like, otherwise, you won't get the money to do your project. But we know that we just made those projections up, so when they don't prove to be correct, we're like, well, that doesn't prove that our vision is wrong. It just proves it took longer than we expected. So yeah, the hockey stick is still going to happen, but it's taking longer. If we do innovation accounting and we make very specific per customer behavior predictions, like, one thing we'll often have people do is sell the magic version of their product on a landing page somewhere, and it's like, don't even say what the product, like how it works, just say benefit it gives you, and see if you can get people to sign up. If people won't sign up for the magic, they're certainly not going to sign up for your product, because magic is always better. And if magic isn't even good enough, if the conversion rate on magic is too low, then you already know that you have a problem. Not that that means that therefore give up, go home. It just means there isn't already enough latent demand for what you're doing, and so you're going to be in a different kind of market than maybe you expected. Does that help? So the minimum viable product truly is the minimum, the least amount required to get that first information. It's not, oh, if it doesn't turn out to an overnight success, we give up. And if you release that pressure to get it right the first time, like, I feel like a lot of us feel like we have to do this circus act to make it seem like we could predict the future, like we're this brilliant visionary, the next Steve Jobs. Like, not even Steve Jobs is as good as Steve Jobs. Like, that's a story that we've all been told. And every company I've worked with, internally, there are these genius heroes who always seem to be able to get it right on the first try that everyone else is trying to emulate. But when you meet the hero and you're like, how do you do it? And if they're being honest with you, they're like, I actually don't know. Right? Or actually, that's not how it happened. It wasn't nearly as easy as everybody thinks. And now I feel incredible pressure to replicate that success again. And so you can imagine the negotiation that happens with the superstar over their next project. Like, they don't ever want to be in a position where they do something and it doesn't work, or they'll have to quit and go to convince some other company they're a superstar. I hear that happen recently. Anyway, is that helpful? Yeah. OK. Any other questions?
So most of the rapid feedback you're talking about seems to be very applicable to like consumer applications where, you know, the cost of trying something, the amount of time it takes to try something is pretty low. I will or will not sign up for Twitter or Facebook or whatever the next thing is.
Yeah.
How does it apply if it's a bigger thing, if it's an enterprise sale or if it's a bigger commitment? I mean,
Yeah.
do you just basically take the same process, but the time scale is longer because the commitment process is longer for each step?
Yes, I mean, that's the short answer. I mean, the long answer is my background's in consumer internet, so I talk that way just naturally about large sample sizes and split tests and quick, like just the way that I can't help it. That's my whole career. What's funny is that Steve Blank, who I mentioned earlier, has a great book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany that I hope you all read. When he talks, his background's in enterprise software. And he gets this question too all the time, except when he gets the question, people say, well, of course this will work in enterprise software, but how will it work on the consumer internet? Because we just assume that the tactics that have worked in one industry, don't work in another. So the answer is truly, it's the principles that matter, not the tactics. And so the principle of the build, measure, learn feedback loop is cross-industry. So for example, in consumer internet, because we're used to having large numbers of customers, we do all this analytics stuff as a crutch. It's because we have it worse than the enterprise people. When you have a lot of customers, you can't get to know any of them particularly well. In fact, you have to rely on archetypes and summaries and assumptions. When you have a small number of customers, it's a huge asset because you can know each of them extremely well, and the experiments that you do can have much higher fidelity. So like physicists don't get to ask electrons like what they're thinking about doing, that they're not available for comment. But when you're studying something that can actually interact with you, it's a whole different ballgame. Question over here? Yeah. What product should Google be pivoting on right now? Listen, I would never presume to tell Google anything about that. I mean, look, what's that? I was invited, but look, I mean, but seriously, like as the outside expert doesn't know anything. You guys know your business way better than I do, and you know what products need to be pivoted. You know. You don't need me to tell you. The better question is, how on earth are we going to get to pivot them? Because we're stuck in a management and accountability framework where pivoting is failure is a problem. So for example, a certain Google product that I know especially well because it was competing with something that I was working on at the time. I don't need to get into too much detail. One of our co-founders at InView went to work on this product for Google. So senior Google people, we can talk about this. So they had a lot of inside information about what we were doing available to them. And at first we were really nervous because it meant that we were going to face competition from Google. And here's what happened. Google spent 2 years working on that product, spent, I can't imagine how much money developing it. And when it finally came out, they launched it with a big bang, put the Google brand right on it. And then when some things didn't go as expected and it turned out to be an embarrassment, like it got pulled and killed. And the whole time we were like, what is going on over there? Because we were iterating and changing constantly over that whole 2-year period. By the time they launched the product, we felt like they'd launched a product that did what our product did 2 years ago. And by giving it the big launch hype, putting the Google stamp on it, the inevitable problems, the same problems we had when we launched, but we were able to pivot because we had a pathetically small number of customers. No one had ever heard of us. That's a huge asset. It's actually a relief because it means you can screw up and nobody knows, nobody cares. Obscurity is a benefit. By putting the Google name on it, by claiming it was the next big thing, Google put that team, I assume, in a position where there was no way for them to pivot. It became an embarrassment to corporate or somebody, and the thing got pulled. Now, that product could have pivoted. It was a really good product. It had a lot of really good things about it. There was no physical reason why it couldn't pivot. But $2 million, 2 years and millions of dollars in, with all these expectations and the Google name, I can't imagine the pressure they were under. I feel bad. So the right question is, what could Google have done to build that same product and put it in a position where it could have pivoted? I actually think that leadership in today's economy means creating platforms for experimentation for your teams. I borrow that phrase from Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit, who's been a big adopter of Lean Startup. So if you want to be a general manager in a big company like Google, and you want Google to be more entrepreneurial, my point of view is it's on you, not on your teams, on you to give them a safe sandbox for experimentation. So for a risky new product, I would never put the Google brand name on it. For shame. And I would never talk to the press about it at all if you can avoid it. And I would try to have it have as small a number of customers as humanly possible while still doing that innovation accounting. Then teams will pivot just fine. Nothing wrong with Googlers. It's a management problem, in my humble opinion. Yes?
So let me follow up with that directly.
Okay.
let's say you write a new mobile application. You're going to post it to the
Hypothetically speaking.
yeah, the App Store or the market. If you do that at Google with the Google name and a blog post, you'll get 100,000 downloads no matter what it is.
Yeah,
I mean, it
it's
can
too
be
bad.
almost anything. But it's true. And by virtue of that, you are now, when people browse to categories, shopping, personal finance,
Yep, you'll be
entertainment,
number one.
whatever, you will be up there. You will have that visibility, and those will lead to clicks, and you will be featured, and you'll jumpstart in a way that you can't do. If you're nobody and you put up an app out there, you may very well just be in the noise, and you'll never break out of that, no matter how great the product is.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, having done this twice,
entrepreneurs never ask hypothetical questions, by the way. So I understand.
yeah. So I can tell you that there's real value. I mean, I know the successes that I've had are in large part because of having that name attached to it. And that initial jump frog, the initial leapfrog made up for, was marketing that I couldn't have bought.
Yeah, look, you get free marketing, but so what? Free marketing is worth so much less than we think. Like, yes, that accelerated your process of success, but only because you had the right product and it worked for your customers. Right? So putting rocket fuel into a rocket that it has like problems with it is not a good idea, right? You accelerate too fast, the thing blows up. Now, sometimes you achieve liftoff because you actually do have the right product. But marketing dollars are not as hard to come by as they used to be. The really great products today have an engine of growth that allows them to grow organically anyway. So yes, Google has huge advantages of putting their brand name on it. It can get you a lot of downloads. But also, there's a huge liability about that. Because
well, that's a good question then. So why is it not okay for Google to fail? Why not take risks and just fall on our face and admit it quickly and move on?
If it was me, I would be celebrating failures and I would make those people heroes. If it was up to me, but like that's the culture that I live in. Now, but see, failure is not what we want to celebrate. We want to celebrate successful pivots away from failure. And that's challenging because it's easy. If you're charismatic, you can get resources for anything. And you can ship stuff and get people to use it, and then you can engage in a ton of what I call success theater to try to make it seem like you're a big success. And so those people tend to get the celebrations, whether they actually add any value or not. They're like a cancer on most organizations, in my opinion. But what do we do instead? We don't want to celebrate those people. We don't want to just celebrate people who fail because they accomplished nothing. So we have to have a system for evaluating which failures were actually instructive. And then we have to celebrate the learning and what the learning turned into in the next try. So yeah, if Google Corporate was fine with people failing and like having the Google name be associated with nasty stuff, like that'd be fine. But I just think that's unrealistic. I mean, I wouldn't be that comfortable. Like if I was Google, I would be launching those things under a different brand name altogether. I wouldn't tell anybody that they're made by Google until they're actually proven to be viable. How do you think Apple does it? Like the stuff that we all consume and wait in line for, we're the first people, the first person who buys the iPad at the Apple Store is the first person to have used the iPad. Come on. Anyway, that's my humble opinion. Helpful?
I didn't follow the last line.
Then maybe I shouldn't have said it. Cancel that. I do think giving teams a platform for experimentation, having clear analytics for testing whether they're making progress or not, and celebrating pivots is the answer. Whatever Apple does, who knows?
All right. Last question?
Make it count.
Or this was the last
Too
question?
much pressure. It's a Google-branded official question. It's going on the internet.
All right, then.
OK, thank you all very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.